lot of issues that we care about and are active in. There's absolutely a personal connection. It's personal, our family. From my very first date with my wife Angela, she shared with me her experiences growing up as not just a daughter to a single mother, but as her mother's caretaker and advocate. My mother suffers from, or her diagnosis, I should say, is bipolar 1 with schizoaffective disorder. Pretty severe diagnosis. But just having learned and been inspired by Angela's experience over the years and her family's really rallying around the support of my mother-in-law, it drove home the lesson that she's doing well. We could say she's thriving. So if there's hope for her, there's hope for almost anybody. We know that there's certainly significant need around the country for improved mental health support. The need for better access to mental health services and care. By the numbers, it was an epidemic before the COVID-19 pandemic. But COVID really put a spotlight on the need and exacerbated the crisis. And so it was with a sense of urgency that we wanted to raise the conversation, the priority level in Congress, and particularly here in the Senate. Sure. Well, a lot of credit, frankly, goes to not just my colleague, Senator Tina Smith on the Democratic side, but my Republican colleague, Senator Tillis, and Senator Ernst. The four of us are the founding chairs of this caucus. It was important to make it bipartisan. Far too often, issues become very partisan very quickly, and it makes it harder to make progress as a result. But mental health challenges know no boundaries. It's not a red state issue. It's not a blue state issue. It's a people issue, and I give them credit for recognizing that. And it was interesting as soon as we broached the conversation about the idea, the first thing, just like your first question to me, the first part of my response was not statistics and position papers, but personal stories, personal connections. And it's become one of the first priorities of this caucus. So how do we use this as a platform for people to share their stories? And in so doing, both deliver the message and maybe a little inspiration for anybody out there to share theirs. One of the big challenges that we have in improving mental health in America is overcoming stigma. There's still far too many people that are either too embarrassed or shy or reluctant to come forward and ask for help when they need help because of the stigma around mental health. We are working hard. And again, this is something I learned first from my wife, Angela. When somebody hurts their leg, we don't hesitate to go get it checked out by a doctor. Maybe you need an x-ray. If you're suffering from a heart attack, there's no shame in going to a doctor and to a hospital and seeking the care that you need. But when it comes to when something may be wrong with the brain, a very precious organ, there's still that stigma. So we need to overcome that stigma. And a lot of that is by, leading by example and willing to share our stories and being very public about experiences. And, that's one of the first goals of the caucus. The first thing I'd point to is the first bill that we've introduced as a caucus. Recently, the country rolled out a 988 system, similar to 911, but a dedicated number, easy to remember, that anybody can call if you need somebody to speak to. If you're in a crisis or observe somebody in a crisis, there's somebody available to talk 24/7 in English or in Spanish, or to text with 24/7 in English or in Spanish to help walk you through a situation, whether it's a crisis or not. Sort of big picture, other priorities for the caucus are, number one, the Safer Communities Act that was passed and signed into law couple of years ago now, almost 2 years ago now, included a huge amount of funding for mental health services across the country. This was the bill that came after the shooting in Uvalde, Texas. Some important pieces when it comes to gun safety that were approved on a bipartisan basis. But this investment in mental health programs is hugely significant. So we want to make sure that those dollars are moving quickly, appropriately, strategically, responsibly, but quickly as well because of the need that's out there. And then the last piece I'll just mention right now is our bipartisan recognition of the need to have a plan when it comes to workforce. If we're encouraging more people to seek help when they need it, and to overcome the stigma and reluctance to seek help, then we need to make sure that there's enough psychiatrists, psychologists, and counselors, therapists, and all the folks who work in the mental health space to be able to provide that support and to provide that level of service. So having a plan with some incentives for a workforce development is another priority. One of the things that we recognize is not every person with a mental illness is homeless. Not every person experiencing homelessness has a mental illness, but there is significant overlap. And so a lot of the strategies at the grassroots level will reflect that. For all the emphasis there is on additional need for housing, particularly affordable housing and transitional shelters, that is important. But it's really hard to bring somebody in from the outdoors sustainably if we're not also providing the mental health support that they need. So funding will go to the states, and we'll work with the states to recognize what are the priority areas. And in California, not just Los Angeles, not just San Francisco, but from San Diego to Sacramento to Fresno. I mean, I don't know a medium to large size city that doesn't have this challenge of utilizing mental health services as a core strategy in supporting the unhoused population come into affordable housing. Separate from the caucus itself, I have my own piece of legislation that would seek to advance through investments a culturally competent and linguistically competent workforce. As I mentioned earlier, with encouraging more people to seek help, when more people seek help, we need to make sure that we have the capacity to provide that support, and not just more doctors and counselors, therapists, et cetera, but the workforce that has the language and cultural competency to best serve that diverse population. Yes, so again, the funding approved through the Safer Communities Act from almost 2 years ago has significant amounts of the mental health dollars dedicated to schools. It's been a long time effort to try to maintain a nurse in every school, right? Whether it's administer medications or putting band-aids on cuts. This is the father of three boys speaking. It'd be a dream scenario to have a counselor or a therapist at every school, or ideally even a wellness center. They're relatively new concepts in the United States, but those that are proven to be very helpful to students and communities. But with resources, we can expand that model much sooner rather than later.